More than 60 women and children and at least 20 men killed in the latest NATO raids on a Libyan village, says Gaddafi's regime. The Western military alliance still insists it's only targeting military centres. How has Gaddafi managed to stay in power months since the air raid started? Are we being told the true story behind the Libyan war? Stay tuned to another edition of News Analysis with me, Homa Leski.
Residential buildings reduced to rubble by a NATO airstrike in the Libyan city of Zliten, 150 kilometers east of the capital, Tripoli. Libya says scores of people, including women and children, have died in the latest NATO air attack on a village near Zliten, what the military alliance has rejected. NATO says there is no evidence showing civilians have been killed in its bombardment.
This was a military facility, clearly, with two huge agricultural buildings that were occupied by Gaddafi forces.
NATO has repeatedly said its operations in Libya are aimed at protecting civilians against forces loyal to a longtime ruler, Muammar Gaddafi. In the past, NATO has boasted of using precision-guided weapons with an accuracy of a few meters in Libya.
They were innocent people, men, women and children. They all died. My 2-year-old daughter and entire families who came here from other areas. They came all the way here to escape the bombings and from the airstrikes. 20 families are dead, children and women, all of them innocent people.
Libyan state television has frequently aired footage of civilians killed or injured in NATO attacks since the war began. NATO airstrikes have not spared the revolutionaries fighting the Gaddafi forces either. Many of them have so far lost their lives in NATO attacks. The revolutionaries have on several occasions protested the bombardment of their positions by NATO warplanes. The Western military alliance insists that its mission in Libya is to help Libyans materialize their legitimate aspirations and topple the Gaddafi regime. Yet many observers believe that Libya's oil is the real reason.
Well, let's get more now from Dr. Webster Griffin Tarpley, author and historian in Washington, Mr. Maher Saloom, human rights activist in Beirut, and John Rees with the Stop the War Coalition in London. Welcome to News Analysis, and I'll start with Mr. Rees in London. What's causing the growing number of civilian casualties? Mr. Rees, 85 killed in one NATO attack today in one incident. Isn't there precision targeting? Isn't there, according to NATO, guided targets towards, of course, military centres?
Yes, well, of course, we don't know the truth about this particular incident. I doubt if it's been verified by journalists because they're restricted in their reporting in Libya. But it's, in general, inconceivable that you can have an air bombardment of the kind that NATO's been carrying out in Libya without there being civilian casualties. And we certainly do know, as your report suggested, that NATO bombing has even hit the rebel positions and caused casualties amongst them. It was been clear since the very beginning of this military operation that NATO was not going to restrict itself to the business of enforcing a no-fly zone or indeed simply of protecting civilians. It's fighting a war, and it's fighting a war for the removal of Colonel Gaddafi from power. It's fighting yet another war for regime change, and we've seen both in Iraq and in Afghanistan exactly what the talk of precision-guided weapons means. There is no such thing as a precision-guided weapon that can avoid civilian casualties, and that's exactly what's coming to light in Libya, just as it was proved to be the case in Iraq and Afghanistan.
All right, let's go to Mr. Tarpley now in Washington. Mr. Tarpley, I guess there in London, Mr. Rees is saying that, well, we can't confirm a lot of the news that is coming in from Libya, either from the Libyan regime, from the anti-Gaddafi fighters. On the one side, NATO is saying that it's hitting command and control centres, military facilities, weapons dumps, rocket launchers. On the other hand, Libyan officials are saying that residential areas are being targeted. How can we make that distinction? How can we get the true news from Libya?
Well, NATO, of course, are famous liars. I myself have visited Libya. I visited a compound of the Al-Khwaldi family, 70 kilometers west of Tripoli. It was purely residential. It included a petting zoo. I personally inspected it. I looked into every doorway and into every basement that I could reach. There was nothing military about it. And there the toll was at least 3 women, 4 children, a Sudanese cook, and some other people. So NATO is simply lying. But on the larger question, how does this civil war go on? I think the big news of the past 24 hours is the chaos of the Benghazi rebel government. And this grows out of the assassination of Commanding General Yunus about 10 or 12 days ago now. You have to imagine a country where the vice president, and in that case that would be Essawi, had joined with the defense minister, Dugeli, and they had joined with a disgruntled general, Khalifa Hifter, he happened to be a CIA agent who had lived in Northern Virginia for 20 years. Those 3, the vice president, the defense minister, and the disgruntled but ambitious general, get together and arrange the assassination of the commanding general of the armed forces. And the agency that carries out the assassination is the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, meaning Al-Qaeda, because I take it that's exactly who the February 18th Martyrs Brigade is. That's called democracy. That government is now in chaos. They're trying to patch that up. I don't think they will.
All right, Dr.
They may have a civil war within a civil war.
If I could just stop here, because you referred to the killing of the general commander, and that is a top issue that we're going to discuss in the course of the programme. But first, I'd like to go to Beirut, Mr. Maher Saloom. Mr. Saloom, just speaking of what NATO is doing in Libya first, before we go to the issue of civil war in Libya, Mr. Rees telling us that what NATO is after is regime change in Libya, but it hasn't been able to do that since it started the air raids. What is taking the NATO forces so long to achieve anything in Libya?
Well, I mean, let me be a military analyst first. If you recognize with my colleagues now in Washington or in London, I mean, the past airstrikes by the NATO have been decreasing a bit. So lately, just like today, and the casualties we've witnessed today on your press TV, as I've seen, so many casualties between women and children, and this is not tolerated by us as human rights activists, whether we are in Lebanon or in Europe or in the States. Now, vis-a-vis the whole plan by the West or the conspiracy today, as I have analyzed so far, the whole situation is to cut down, I mean, the forces by the rebels, I mean the TNC or the Transitional National Council, and never, dismiss the whole idea of assassination. I do agree with my colleague Webster from Washington, D.C. The whole situation by assassinating such a general, and he was the Minister of the Interior of the regime itself, Gaddafi forces back then. Now they're trying to balance between both forces, between the East and the West. And the whole plan, to me, as I analyze it, is to have 2 independent states within one state, which is Libya. And the whole interest is to cut down the Libyan forces and minimize its forces, actually the Gaddafi forces, and include another army or a minimal army of the TNC or the Transitional National Council, headed by Mustafa Abdul Jalil. Hence, for them to let them invest for the oil and gas tanks, whether they are, or millions of barrels that are within the lands of the Republic of Libya today.
Okay, John Rees in London, how viable do you see these kinds of claims when you say that NATO is after regime change? How do you see the comments being made there by our guest in Beirut?
Well, I think it's undoubtedly true that the oil resources, the natural resources of Libya are an important issue for the Western powers, although it has to be said that they'd struck deals with the Gaddafi regime itself over these issues. So I don't see that as the only important issue at stake for NATO. Actually, I think even more important than the oil resources was the desire to intervene in the process of the Arab revolutions and to try and get some control over their spread. Of course, the military intervention in Libya happened at exactly the same time as the military intervention by Saudi Arabia in Bahrain. And we know that intervention was sanctioned by Robert Gates just a couple of days, the US Secretary of State, just a couple of days before it took place. So I look on the military interventions sanctioned by the US on the part of Saudi Arabia into the Bahrain revolution and the military intervention into Libya as part of a single package designed to give the major powers some foothold in the fast developing Arab revolutions, to try and draw a line under them, to try and get control, which I think to a large degree they've been successful in doing, to get control of the rebel forces in Libya, to make them vassals of to make them dependent on the Western powers. And I think it's precisely that dependency which has produced the splits and the weaknesses and the divisions within the TNC that we've seen so graphically in recent weeks.
Right, and just referring to those divisions, Dr. Tarpley in Washington, you were referring there in your earlier remarks about that exact case. And let's talk about the relation that the NATO forces, especially the United States, has had with these anti-Gaddafi forces. A lot of observers saying that they are linked to al-Qaeda, that there is a secret collision between the United States and al-Qaeda, a marriage of convenience in some people's words. How do you see this relationship now that the issue of civil war is being raised? Is that something that NATO was prepared to confront?
Well, the rivalry appears to have been between Yunus, who had been a minister in Gaddafi's governments and a longtime associate of Gaddafi, sort of internal opposition, and then this guy Hifter, Khalifa Hifter or Haftar in various English renderings. That was the person who had lived in Northern Virginia, darling of the CIA, darling of the Pentagon, and had gone back. So there'd been a conflict between Yunus and Hifter. The reports were that the Yunus people were trying to call in NATO strikes on Hifter, and Hifter would respond by using his better connections to call in NATO strikes on the other side. So this is totally chaotic. The embarrassment growing out of this political assassination with the help of al-Qaeda is so great now that the Norwegians have dropped out completely as of August 1st. Norway, which was 10% of the bombing effort, has dropped out. The Dutch, the Netherlands are still there, but they refuse to bomb. Canada will drop out next month. Berlusconi of Italy says that he was forced into this by the United States, by Obama and Hillary Clinton, and by President Napolitano of Italy, an old communist, interestingly enough, and by the votes of the neo-communists in the Italian parliament. Here in the United States, we've got a 15-vote margin in the House of Representatives. If 15 votes flip the other way, the House of Representatives will cut off funding for this. And now that you've mentioned al-Qaeda, we here in Washington, D.C. have an al-Qaeda base. And the al-Qaeda base has been created by the State Department. The Libyan embassy on Virginia Avenue, close to the Watergate complex, the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts, the Key Bridge, and the Whitehurst Freeway, right in the middle of all that, there's now an al-Qaeda base because the Libyan Rebel Council, the Benghazi gaggle of Libyan Islamic Fighting Group and al-Qaeda have taken over the building. So here in Washington, we're at grave danger compared to what we were before.
Mr. Maher Saloom, is there a covert relationship between the United States and al-Qaeda in Libya? What's your take on that?
It could be, but I do not have enough proof tonight or anywhere right now. But I believe in what Mr. Webster have been saying in Washington does have a parallel. Say, what do I have to say now is that the al-Qaeda have a mutual interest in cutting or in hurting or in bringing down the TNC inside Benghazi, as we have witnessed the assassination of Abdul Fattah Yunus, the major commander of the TNC inside Benghazi, or the east, let's say, parts of Libya today. Now, the mutual interest, I think, by the West and al-Qaeda could be in hurting or minimizing the power of the TNC or the rebels inside Libya in order for them to create a certain balance equally vis-a-vis the Gaddafi forces inside Libya. Hence, there will be a chance for them to let their any dialogue maybe in the future and where they can have it under the auspices, let's say, of Hillary Clinton, the Minister of State, or the Secretary of State of the United States of America, and the European, for sure, Union under what is called the NATO alliance, let's say, militarily, and then we can create a chance for dialogue between both factions or the conflicting factions, I mean Gaddafi forces and the rebels themselves under Mustafa Abdul Jalil. In case this scenario succeeds in bringing down, I mean, the war and letting the peace, arrive inside Libya or rises inside Libya, then we have a great chance of providing stability and economical stability, I mean, back towards the lands of Libya. But I think it will take months and months ahead, or maybe years ahead, to let back Libya to its feet. And just like we witnessed, even though under the Gaddafi forces, he had a great economy or a boosting economy, but unfortunately we didn't have equal and justice or social justice under the regime of Gaddafi towards his own people, and his own corruption has prevailed in bringing down the whole social or the social justice inside the state of Libya.
Well, the major question now to many people, John Rees in London, if I could put that question to you, is whether the TNC is going to be a suitable replacement for the Gaddafi regime. And that's a question that's being raised a lot now in various articles by political observers. The government in Britain, where you are, some have been saying that it's been making a hasty approach alongside other foreign powers in immediately recognising the TNC as the legitimate government in Libya. Do you think that has been a hasty approach, that there's still not enough knowledge about who is making up the TNC and whether they are suitable to replace the Gaddafi regime?
Well, the British government's foreign policy is now in a mess over Libya. It assumed that there would be a quick victory, and it's proved to be exactly the opposite of that. And I think that they're very, very worried about that. So that you see William Hague, the British Foreign Secretary, simultaneously, almost on the same day, making statements recognising the TNC on the one hand, and then on the other hand saying that he would be perfectly happy if Colonel Gaddafi were to stay in Libya as long as he steps down from power, that there won't be any question of International Criminal Court or anything like that. So I think we can see that the stalemate in the war in Libya, the inability to get a quick victory, is producing chaos inside the British foreign policy establishment on this issue. And one of the difficulties they have, of course, is that their own intervention in Libya, their own drive to get control of the TNC, has entirely broken that institution as a proper representative of the original revolutionary outburst by the Libyan people. A bought revolution, a revolution that's been purchased by the imperial powers, of course, will only have figures within it who are vying for influence with the imperial powers, who want to create a situation where they are the representatives of the people with the money and the guns inside the TNC. That will produce the rivalries that we've seen break out in an absolutely murderous fashion recently. So the process of intervention, the process of the major powers becoming involved in Libya, was always going to corrupt and break the TNC as an effective representative of the opposition to Gaddafi.
Well, if the situation is now near a stalemate in Libya, if I could put this question to Dr. Tarpley, do you think, Dr. Tarpley, that NATO will, in the near future, maybe make the decision, as our guest in Beirut was earlier suggesting, to start negotiations to stop the military campaign and even talk of a solution that would include a division in Libya?
I think you're going to have a lot of trouble dividing Libya, because I think this is a country that has strong nationalism, and the fact that Gaddafi is still in power in most of Libya, certainly most of the population, indicates that Gaddafi has real popular support. People who were lukewarm on Gaddafi have been driven back into the Gaddafi camp by the atrocities and war crimes of NATO. So now the question is, where does this all go? It seems to me that the NATO coalition is falling apart. The Benghazi Rebel Council is falling apart. Again, this is now the season of the town meetings here, right? The Congress is no longer in Washington. They're at home, and they're getting an earful. I know in Vermont this morning, the congressman from Vermont, Representative Welsh, has gotten an earful from a bunch of citizens who want this war ended. The United States is sick of war, and the people are, at least, and this has no popular support. It never did. The point I would make is that from the very beginning, the effective armed forces of the rebellion, and it was armed and violent from the first day, were the Libyan Islamic group and Al-Qaeda. And since then we've had, since Al-Qaeda is the CIA Arab Legion and always has been, we've had fighters coming back from Afghanistan and Pakistan all over the Arab and Islamic world have been brought in to fight for the Benghazi Rebel Council. So the press has not done their job, but this is a monstrosity, and this is now the conjurees and gaggle that have moved in to the Libyan embassy on Virginia Avenue here in Washington, D.C. And I think that's something to be really worried about. And I think congressmen will be hearing about that too.
All right, well, if you're saying then that NATO is getting help from these militants, in your words, from these anti-Gaddafi forces in Beirut, Mr. Maher Saloom, why then has it still not been able to force Gaddafi out, to end rather the civil war, the conflict in Libya? Why is this war continuing? Or I may ask, what is giving the Gaddafi regime so much strength to withstand?
Because I believe there are some still tribes and people who are representatives of the Republic of Libya that they are supporting and backing the Gaddafi regime and himself and his sons, for sure, Saif al-Islam and other ruling sons. But let me pinpoint something that it came up to my mind while Mr. Webster was speaking. I believe Al-Qaeda, the whole plan or the conspiracy towards Libya is to form a certain part of Libya. It could be in the south and the deserts of Libya, where they can have their own independent mini-state as Libyans that are followers or supporters of Al-Qaeda, maybe Osama bin Laden, the late one, or al-Zawahiri today as a ruler of Al-Qaeda internationally. Now, the whole situation between Benghazi and the capital, Tripoli, and Al-Qaeda is to separate those three and make a threesome division inside the Republic of Libya, where Arabs of Libya are divided, unfortunately. I believe there should be a part of it, I believe also, in parallel with what Mr. Webster mentioned earlier, a certain nationalistic support towards the Gaddafi by his followers. But what we need to apply, I wish the West can apply the measures of the true democracy and the tools that they can supply themselves inside the West, whether using the Congress, the Senate and the Congress in the States, or the parliaments inside Europe. Now what we need is to develop our skills, democratically speaking, inside Libya, support the people of Libya in order for them to choose whatever the constitution they want, their own new president one day, and the new parliament that they seek for. There shall be justice for all and socially uncorrupt or not corruption, no corruption under the lands of Libya.
Thanks very much. I'm afraid we've run out of time. Mr. Maher Saloom, human rights activist, joining us there live from Beirut. I'd also like to thank John Rees from Stop the War Coalition in London and Dr. Webster Griffin Tarpley, author and historian, joining us live from Washington. Thanks so much for staying with this edition of News Analysis. From me, Homa Lezgi, and our team here in Tehran, it's goodbye.